Thank you, Steve. Our next presentation is by Bill Burgel. Bill, too, has 5 decades of experience in the railroad industry as an employee and as a consultant. He holds degrees in engineering and a master's in structural geology, and has worked in railroad engineering and operations, including serving as a chief train dispatcher for Union Pacific, then serving 4 years with the Surface Transportation Board for Conrail and Canadian National Railroad's Elgin, Joliet, and Eastern Chicago acquisitions. He's played a critical role in the development of the world's first computer-aided train dispatching office. And in 2010, he managed Passenger Rail Investment and Improvement Act submittal for Washington State's Department of Transportation for their higher speed rail effort. He's also managed passenger station sidings and effort for Amtrak's Albany and Oregon City passenger stations. And he is a professional geologist. So Bill, it's a pleasure to have you give your presentation here. Let's welcome Bill.
Thank you, Christine. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, so let's talk. Allison introduced me as a UP employee. I worked for them for 17 years, and I'm no longer an employee. I want to be careful to let you all know that I don't speak for the railroad industry. However, I am pretty vocal, and I make sure if I do say something, I do clear it with them, and I'm very conscious of that, in fact. This is my agenda. I'll talk a little bit about the supply chain, like Steve said. It's an incredible, complex situation that the American railroads, believe it or not, were one of the key decisions in outsourcing a lot of the goods first to Mexico and then to Asia, in terms of how you make money and still transport this thing across the ocean and then throughout the U.S. The American railroads were part of that discovery. It was incredibly cost-effective to use the railroads. When they come to the coast here, they'll go 500 miles at a minimum, and usually about 2,000 miles before they land on this west coast. This is a picture of Brooklyn Yard, and all railroads make money 3 ways with their trains. You see what I call a regular boxcar train that's got gondolas, and those kind of cars and trains go into basically a classification yard. And each time those cars are touched, it's called a work event. And so what the Union Pacific and all railroads are trying to do is minimize the number of work events per train, per car. This is an intermodal yard, a Brooklyn Yard. It's 87 acres and it's chock full. It's very busy, and there's some movement in terms of here the trains pull in and the trains are static. The trains don't move, but the containers are moved in and out by the cranes that you see on hand there. And so that's how those work. And the most effective train that makes money for all the railroads are what we call a unit train. And this is where they basically, the locomotives and the cars will go to say a grain elevator in Nebraska, and all Union Pacific and BNSF will do is put their crews on those trains and transport those trains all the way to Kalama or Longview for export. And so it's pure profit for the railroad. They don't touch it on either end, other than they deliver it to the grain elevator to load it, and to the grain elevator to empty it, and it's pure profit. So that's where they make their most money per train. So this is intermediate in terms of how they go. And so this is Brooklyn Yard. I'll go through these real quick here. This is the network here, and this is kind of how, if you're focused on U.S. operations, this is what you see. And you can see basically we have the 5 major ports. Portland's not on here because even though it's a viable intermodal port that's ready to go, nobody's using it. because you have all these other ports that are taking basically all the business. And really, Portland doesn't stand a chance in this atmosphere. But you got the two carriers, you got Union Pacific and BNSF that call on these 5 major ports. LA Long Beach, I'll talk about them in a minute. But this is if you're looking at it from a US only point of view. But this is how the shippers, and what Steve was saying, how complex supply chains are at. This next slide will show you how people around the world are looking at the west coast of the US. They're looking at it like this. And basically you have ports of call way down in Mexico and Lazaro Cardenas, Manzanillo, and then you've got the 5 in the US, and then 2 more up in Canada. And not only do you have 9 ports to call on, you also have 4 railroads to deal with. I mean, you have the Canadian National and CP Rail that call on Canada, and CP Rail now calls down in Mexico as well with their recent merger. So you have to kind of understand that it's not just the 5 ports you're dealing with from a worldwide point of view. You're dealing with 9 ports, and these are all up and operational. And if you look just south of Los Angeles, near Baja, at the northern, just south of Ensenada, the Mexican government just announced plans to take another look at putting an intermodal port there. So stay tuned for that, just at a place called Punta Colonet. But this is LA Long Beach. This is Port of LA with, it's the biggest, the busiest port we have. And next door to it is Long Beach, just a few TEUs below that. But together, they're taking 20% of all the U.S. shipments on the West Coast. And just for comparison, the one here in Coos Bay has been, say they would handle about 2 million TEUs, and that's why this slide, this is basically with the footprint to handle 2 million TEUs there at the Port of Oakland. But to go back to LA Long Beach, you've got basically out of LA Long Beach, you run on UP and BN, you're running about 100 trains a day each way out of the LA basin. The one thing that makes LA a very favorable port is when these containers land. These containers, these 20-foot or 40-foot equivalents, will be trucked to a nearby distribution center. And there you'll have a load of hammers in one container, you'll have a load of wrenches in another. And what these distribution centers they'll mix and match each one of these import containers, and they'll make a domestic box that's going to be a 40-footer, a 48-footer, or a 53-footer, and it will go on the UP or the BN east out of LA, and it will go specifically to a hardware in Topeka, Kansas, or in Brainerd, Minnesota. Those are tailor-made there in LA, and so that's the real value that you get. It's not a matter of just taking a container off a train or off a ship and put it on a train and shipping it. LA does so much more in terms of tailor-making these boxes for specific cities throughout the U.S., and it's done right down there by San Pedro Bay. The other thing that's happening here too is Steve mentioned that the Houthis and the Somali pirates in Red Sea have closed the Red Sea for the time being, and there is some hope currently that that's going to reopen. But because it takes 9 to 14 days, almost 2 weeks, and if you figure at least $100,000 to $200,000 a day, you're talking millions of dollars of rerouting cost. This is actually cost effective for a shipper out of Shanghai to bring loads of containers. In this case, they basically just put them right on a train, and then they ship them all the way to Elizabeth, New Jersey, and then they put them back on a ship to Rotterdam. So it saves about 5 or 6 days, and it's worth it to these shippers to do that. So those are some of the business. This is called bridge traffic, and it goes through across the country as well. So the next, I'll talk a little bit about the different railroads. Union Pacific is one of the major carriers out here, and basically its headquarters is in Omaha, as you know, and it's the western 2/3 of the U.S., and it just announced a merger with Norfolk Southern, which would continue it to the East Coast as well. But when these intermodal trains get built on the West Coast, usually their first port of call is Chicago or Kansas City or Denver or Houston. That's as far as they go. They go 2,000 miles without stopping. There's no reason to stop before then. Very seldom do they call on Salt Lake or Denver. Those usually, a lot of that business goes by truck. BN is the same situation. It's owned by Warren Buffett, as you know, and basically their ideas are similar to UP, but again, they're the big competitor out west as well. And this is how they view it. They run 60 or 70 trains across what they call the Northern Transcon, and then the Southern Transcon out of LA, Long Beach, that's over 100 trains a day. And you can see where they run clear across the country. And these trains are all 15,000, 16,000 feet long. I was in Needles, California earlier, and it's nonstop trains through there. These are not small trains. They're locomotives at the head end, in the middle, and at the end, and they're running, like I say, 100 each day, each way. But the other news that you have to take in consideration when you're siting a port on the West Coast is you also a lot of these ships call on Vancouver, BC, and there you got CP, Canadian Pacific, which merged with Kansas City Southern, and that's their routing. And you can see when they get towards Chicago, most of their trains come down into Chicago. And so that import traffic comes in at Vancouver, BC, and goes right into Chicago. That's no different than UP or BNSF. And Canadian Pacific has a branch line, a strategic alliance with Union Pacific that comes into Portland, so they ship that way as well. You also have, this is CP Rail that comes also from, you have Canadian National as well as CP that comes into Chicago. So that's really what the ports up here in the Pacific Northwest have to compete against. It's not just Port of Portland, it's not Seattle, not Tacoma, but the big kahuna up in the Pacific Northwest is Vancouver, BC. I'll talk locally about the distance that you have to go between Coos Bay and Eugene. It's about 112 miles, and then you got another 140 miles between Eugene and Portland. So it's about 230, 240 miles from Portland to Coos Bay here by rail. It's a circuitous route. I high-railed quite a few years ago, but it's going to, all those estimates that it's going to take to upgrade it are true. But I estimate that what the port would do if they were to do this is they would run these trains into Eugene Yard. Eugene Yard was just leased to the Central Oregon and Pacific Railroad. They're headquartered down in Roseburg, but UP gave them the keys to that rail yard. That's just basically a conventional switching yard. Right now, hardly anybody's using it. They use it to store Amtrak trains, and that's about it. But this red line is the Coos Bay line coming in, and you can see where it crosses the green line, which is the other railroad. So only UP has rights into the Coos Bay terminal. BNSF, which is that green line, doesn't have rights out here at all. So that's a key factor in siting port. You only have one railroad carrier to call on, whereas all these other ports up and down the West Coast have two railroads to call from. But Coos Bay only has the one. For BN to actually access this out here, they would have to build a line from the green line out to the red line, so they could get access to the port of Coos Bay. And in my being a former chief dispatcher with the railroad, what would have to happen is UP would, or that the port's railroad would bring cuts of cars into the Eugene yard and stage them there until such time as they had, Union Pacific has shown that they prefer to run a 15,000-foot train east out of Broken Yard every day, and they do that routinely and safely. And so I would imagine that's what they'll do, but there's a couple reasons they can't do that right now under the present scenario. I'll talk about that in a minute. But they would put together these trains in Eugene Yard. The loads going, or the eastbound trains at Eugene Yard would get assembled there, and ideally they would build a 15,000-foot train there at Eugene. Again, this is my opinion. I haven't shared this with anybody. But the reverse would also be true. A 15,000 train would come into Eugene Yard and be broken out and then brought into Coos Bay from there. But this is kind of what they're facing against. This is the route between Eugene and Portland. But it's basically, you can see that third line down, you have the typical length of sidings is 7,300 feet. And basically that's the kind of, typically that's what UP will run these trains at about 7,300 feet. Because you run the passenger trains, you've got 6 passenger trains that run between Eugene and Portland every day. So that's kind of, right now, that's what the current operation is. And there's about 20 or 24 trains a day that run through there, including the passenger trains. So that's the current scenario. And this is kind of what's going on at Portland right now. And this is, you can go down there. This is at the north end of Portland by Powell Boulevard, and you can get up on an overpass there and see them building these trains. And this is a train that they are assembling. It's basically, Broken Yard is 4,000 feet long. And basically they put 4 sections each of cuts of cars that are, 3,500 to 4,000 feet long, and they make one train 15,000 feet long. And when they're doing it, it basically they pull out over 3 road crossings here, and they block these crossings for 2 to 3 hours each time, every day. So if you're in this area, if you ever get to this part of Portland, you want to be careful not to get into this mess, okay? They call this the wall. And basically it takes about that long, and if they have some problem with the car, they have to set it out, and that takes another 45 minutes to an hour. The problem, I said that UP, they've demonstrated they can successfully run a 15,000-foot train from Portland all the way to Chicago. That's not the problem. But if you're running a 15,000-foot train from Eugene to Portland and you have passenger trains, you have a situation where you have a 15,000-foot train pulls into siding, but if you have a following passenger train, you can't get around it. And I call this situation, being a chief dispatcher, I have full license to say this, I call this undispatchable. So you cannot do this. And so UP will, depending on how this unfolds, they will advocate for longer sidings, probably at public expense, to handle these long trains should this go forward. With that, I'll close it and turn it over to Mike and to Bob. Thank you.